Well, hello everybody and welcome to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey.
Hello everyone.
Unlocking Your Truth is a talk show about metaphysics and spirituality. And we broadcast live from CIVL across the Fraser Valley on 101.7 FM from the unceded territory of the Stolo Nation. And we also live stream the show on YouTube and our Facebook group, which is the Awaken Your Psychic Abilities Facebook group. You can find our podcast on drlesliephillips.com. If you're new to the show, let me explain a little bit about Unlocking Your Truth. It is a talk show about metaphysics and spirituality. And we've been running the talk show for about 4.5 years. And every week we try to educate you and inspire you. And our listeners, sometimes they send in requests about what they would like us to talk about. And this week we are going to respond to a number of listeners who have requested that we have a discussion about children and psychic abilities. So people have asked about this in different ways. Some people have written in and said that they have a child who is having experiences. So the child is actually aware of spiritual phenomena. And that's different depending on the child, but some of them are seeing spirit guides and communicating with spirit guides, for example. And people have also asked us about indigo children, crystal children, star seeds, and rainbow children. So that's what we want to do the show about tonight. And I'm just going to bring a couple of different perspectives to the subject, because one of the things that I really notice with us humans is that we really like to compartmentalize things. We like to put things in nice, neat little boxes and label them and say, well, this is this group and that's that group, and these are the characteristics of this group and that's the characteristics of that group. And I think that's helpful for the intellect to understand, but it is a big limit on a wider perspective on reality. Now, can't blame us. We're in human bodies. We're living in these physical bodies in the physical world, and the physical world is it's limited by time and space. So we experience our reality as a linear thing. And so one of those things is the human growth cycle. You know, you're born, you're a baby, then you're a toddler, then you're a child, and so on into old age. So we tend to look at children as immature, that they don't really know very much and they need our help to understand how the world works. And that's true to some degree. They're new in this incarnation to the physical world. And yes, we can help them to orient themselves to the physical world. On the other hand, we are all projections of consciousness from source energy. We are all projections of an infinite consciousness. We are all projections of the multidimensional self, whether the word that you use for that is soul or higher self or spirit. And so some of these little babies are wise old souls. Some of these little babies are, yes, they're in a young body, but they have a ton of spiritual information and an enormous amount of experience living in on Earth in a physical body and other things as well. So if we expand our perspective beyond what we see on the physical, then we can understand that it's quite possible for a young baby to have more energy and information than a mature individual. So that's the first comment that I would make about this.
And that's interesting.
But also, And this is a generalization, I think, for everybody, that when we're born, we come from divine source energy.
True.
So we're in the non-physical, and we get a new body. We come into the new body, and we're fresh. We're fresh from the non-physical world. And so we haven't yet oriented to the physical world. We haven't yet fully switched over to the focus of the physical senses. So we still have that connection. And this reminds me of this really cute story that somebody told me once about a young family. So there was a mum and a dad and a little daughter who probably was about, I don't know, 2 years old, and they had a new baby. And the little girl kept asking the parents if they would leave her alone with her little brother. And of course, as all parents are, they were worried. You know, you never know what a little toddler will do. Sometimes kiddies get jealous of their siblings. And so for a while they resisted, but the little girl was so insistent that they rigged up one of those baby monitors, and then they let her go into the room with her baby brother on her own, but they listened on the baby monitor. And what they heard was the little girl asking the baby, you know, I'm starting to forget what it's like to be with God. You know, I'm starting to forget what it's like to be connected with the spirit world. Can't you tell me, can't you remind me what it's like so I don't forget?
Yeah, I think it goes, tell me what God looks like, I forgot. Because I told you the story.
I think I've heard it from a few different places.
Well, I'm a reliable
But
source.
yeah, you are. Yeah. So that's such a cute story, and it just,
It is.
I mean, it reminds us, it illustrates the point, doesn't it? That when we're born, we are all open. We are still have access to our spiritual senses, to our psychic abilities. And babies have a different perception of reality. Little toddlers have a different perception of reality. They're not so firmly embedded within time and space as older humans are. Right? And we all come in with psychic abilities. We all come in with a life purpose. And then what happens is, by necessity, we have to adjust to the physical world. Okay, so we've got this vehicle called a physical body. It operates in time and space, and it's got physical senses. And so we start to connect with those physical senses, and we start to use them to experience physical reality. And then we have these things called parents and other adults that teach us about the world. And depending upon those influences, we may retain the openness of our psychic abilities, or we may start to shut them down till they are almost completely shut down. And it really depends upon the culture that you're born to, the society that you live in, and the form of education that you go through. It depends on whether the idea of psychic abilities are accepted or whether they're not. Whether there is an expectation embedded within the culture that that's a thing, or whether they validate other things like the intellect. And for sure, in the Western culture, at least until very recently, we've really strongly validated the intellect, and the education system is very focused on the intellect. And so we tend to invalidate the spiritual abilities. And so as time goes by and the child grows up and they start going to school and being passed through the education system and having to meet the expectations of their parents and society and culture, then they learn, well, it doesn't really help me very much when I am attuned to this other way of being and this other way of sensing reality. And I seem to fit in more when I focus on my physical senses rather than my spiritual senses. So that's a kind of general process that happens when you come into the body. And so, you know, you've heard these stories of, well, I'm very psychic because I'm the seventh son of a seventh son. And I think what's really happening there is that's a family that validates psychic abilities. And if you're born into a family that validates psychic abilities, then you're not going to get the same degree of shutdown if you're born into a staunchly religious family that believes that being psychic is the work of the devil or something like that. So now let's talk as well a little bit about some of the characteristics and signs that you might see in a child that they are tapping into their psychic abilities. And so let's talk about like the 4 main psychic senses. There are lots of them. There's at least 22 of them, but some are fairly common. So we've all seen the little child who's the little know-it-all. The one that's the constant chatterbox, you know, knows everything or constantly asking questions.
That was me.
So that's So that's a sign of a psychic ability that we can call knowingness or claircognizance, connecting to your higher wisdom or your inner wisdom. So if your child seems to just know stuff and be constantly wanting to share what they know, then they may be demonstrating that particular psychic sense. Another example is the sensitive child. Child that's really super sensitive, especially sensitive on an emotional level, really taps into, is affected by how other people are feeling. And this is kind of like the classic empath as a child, someone who is tuning into their psychic ability of clairsentience or clear feeling. Or we get kids who have invisible friends. Or this is me, see stuff that other people didn't see. You know, so the invisible friend is a classic sign of psychic abilities. You know, the child is seeing their spirit guide and communicating with their spirit guide or some other being. Or as one of the ladies who wrote into us, who suggested this week's show, you know, seeing dead people, people who've passed away. So that's a sign of your clairvoyance, your ability to see as spirit. And then finally, the other thing can be that the child is talking and hearing the spirit guide, which would be their clairaudience. And so there's lots of signs that we can see in our kids that show us that they're in tune with their psychic abilities.
I met one time, a young man, a friend of mine, his son, and at the age of about 6 or 7, he used to say to him, he says, let's meet on the astral plane tonight in your dreams. And they actually used to meet up in specific places. They had such a intense connection between the two of them. But his son was quite gifted with meeting. Like he used to meet the dad as opposed to like pull the dad into his dreams. It was amazing.
Very cool. And on that subject, there's lots of examples of twin children who are very telepathically connected and very aware of what's going on in each other's reality, whether they're in the same place or not. So I need to ask you at this point, Corey, is it time for a break?
Not yet, Dr. Leslie. We've still got about 4 or 5 minutes to go.
Okay, that's good. I was going to switch the direction of the discussion a little bit. And so
we have some questions for after the break. So
Okay, so the other, in thinking about this topic, the other thing I wanted to talk about was this generational thing. Because if you're in spiritual circles, then you've heard reference to the indigo children, and the indigo children are supposed to be people who were born maybe from the mid 1960s to the late 1980s, and these are people who, and again, this is us humans putting things in boxes. They're warriors, and their purpose is to come and rail against and fight against convention and conventional systems, kind of like opening the gateway to a new consciousness on the planet. And then after those indigo children, we've got this generation which they call the crystal children, who have a more peaceful, harmonizing, gentler energy. And they are meant to be here as examples of how we could be and how we could behave. And then we've also got rainbow children, who are kind of like the implementers of the change. So to ensure that we move into this awakened consciousness. And the star seeds, yeah, who are said to be evolved beings from other planets who are incarnating on Earth at this time to help us introduce this new era.
I've never run into or met a starseed child. I've met indigo children and a couple of the other ones we spoke about. I've never met a starseed child.
Well, I'm going to talk about them a little bit more.
Well, why don't we get a couple more minutes after the break? Instead of going right back into that, why don't we, or we can do it now. Do you want to go for a break now and then come back and answer those questions from our...
Well, I have a little bit more that I want to say.
Okay.
And so, which we might, come back after the break and just finish off this and then take questions, if that's all right with you.
Sure. Yeah,
okay.
That sounds great. We got time for that. We've got lots of time.
Listeners, you've been tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with Corey. And tonight's show is about psychic children. We'll be back after these messages.
Yes. And we're back from a wonderful break. Beep, 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 beep. Hello. We have George on the line with us, by the way.
Welcome back, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corey. Yep. Tonight's show is all about psychic children. Some of our listeners asked us to talk about that, so that's what we're doing. And I wanted to just take a kind of perspective on sort of a generational approach. So before the break, we talked about these labels that people have given. I think it started with Doreen Virtue and maybe some others, to label the different groups of children as indigo children, rainbow children, crystal children, star seeds. There's probably even some other names as well. And one perspective, or my perspective, is this, that every generation is being born into a higher consciousness. Every generation is benefiting from the expansion that has been lived out by their parents' and grandparents' generation. And especially right now, and I'll talk about what I mean by right now in a minute, but so humanity is evolving. The consciousness of humanity is expanding. So of course, every new generation of children may seem to be brighter, smarter, with a more expanded consciousness or a different potential than the generation before. And right now on Earth, we're living through a period of in our galactic cycle, which is offering the opportunity for accelerated, expanded growth. And some people refer to it as the harmonic convergence, and you've heard all about the Mayan calendar and everything. And the Earth, travels through the galaxy and has different galactic alignments at different times over a 50,000 year cycle. And so in our lifetime, it is lining up with the center of the galaxy, opening a window for higher and higher frequencies of light to impact our consciousness on Earth. And this really started in around the 1980s when we talk about the indigos coming in, and really been accelerating ever since. And so, and I want to talk about excuse me. So of course, people being born at this time, it's souls that want that growth and that acceleration, that want to be alive in a body in this time, this consciousness shifting time, to have the exposure to those higher vibrations of light and that opportunity to awaken. And if we just, again, cast our minds over some of the ways that we've categorized generations. So even if we're not talking in spiritual senses, we've got the silent generation, people who are like 75 to in their 90s now, born in late 1920s to the wartime, 1945. They're called the silent generation, and their focus was survival. It was a time of the Depression. It was a time of war. Their bandwidth was taken up with survival. And when you're in the survival mode, there's not much bandwidth for a spiritual focus. The generation that came after them is the baby boomer generation. And because their parents had suffered lack, their focus was on accumulation and materialism for the most part. And then we now come into the generation after the baby boomers, which is the one that's coinciding with the indigo kids. And one label for that is Generation X. And now they're starting seeking alternatives, longing for something different, feeling perhaps like they don't fit in, like there's something wrong with the world, and trying to find a place where they feel like they do belong. And then after that, the millennials. And actually, that's still fitting in with the time band that we're calling is for the indigo children being born. And then after that, overlapping, we have these crystal rainbow children and starseed children, which, people say were born 1997 and beyond. I tend to think that you can kind of have amazing people with amazing abilities born at any point in time and any point in history. But because of the harmonic convergence and because of the acceleration of light and the evolution of consciousness, then it really is a big thing that we're witnessing. Well, Corey, it looked like you kept putting your finger up.
Yes, I have a statement. That you were on a roll, so I didn't want to disturb you.
Yeah.
What I found with kids today is they're extreme now. They're very like prior to the electronic age, like with cell phones, computers, online stuff. Kids would. They more or less melded into each other. You had spiritual kids and you had non-spiritual kids, but now with the electronic age, I find kids have separated. They have just like adults did prior. Adults used to be, you have their spiritual and they didn't hang around with the worldly people, and now I find kids are like that too. They're so into their electronic world and they don't see outside, or they don't see into they're not very introspective when it comes to their inner being, to their to their spirituality. And yet on the other side of that, like that separation, you have kids that are very, very in tune, even more so than they have been for many generations. Do you find that? Or
Well, what I find is as the vibration increases, the polarization
Exactly.
increases.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing in every aspect of our world is an increased polarization, more extremes, in all walks of life, really. You know,
Well,
whether you look at
what's going to happen to these children? What's going to happen to these kids that are extremely going like to that far end where they don't even interact with each other when they're together. They're always on their phones. They're always like they're talking to each other on their literally talking to each other on their phones. What's going to happen to these kids?
well, I can look at that for you if that's a question
No,
you would
no,
like
no,
me
yeah,
to
no.
answer.
Actually, it's a question I have because
Or is it
when
a
you
rhetorical question?
no,
Um,
not really. That's a question I put to you. Like, what do you feel is going to occur with them? And I don't want to
so
like,
the kids you're now talking about the ones that don't have a spiritual focus. You're talking about the ones that are glued to their cell
yeah,
phones. What
the ones
ones
that
are
are
you?
locked in, they're locked into the electronic world. Yeah.
So you've got this. I mean, you could even see that as a polarity. You know, it doesn't really matter what end of the polarity you go to, whether you go to a shutdown level of experience or an expanded communication experience, you're still exploring the same polarity. So if one goes to the far extreme of being uncommunicative, that energy has to balance out with the same extreme of opening of communication, which is actually what opening your psychic abilities is, and what spiritual evolution is. Communication is very high vibration. Love is communication, is open communication. Fear is shut down, closed down communication. So you know, this show was about exploring, you know, the kids with psychic abilities as opposed to the other extreme, I suppose. But I can look at it for you if you're bringing that up, Corey. Give me a minute. Well, I just think what I said is correct, that it doesn't really matter. Both sides of that are serving the expansion of human consciousness. And both sides of that are preparing the way for another generation that will benefit from the expansion that this generation is doing.
Interesting. I
Mhm.
mean, that's always the way it's been in history. I mean, one generation to the next generation, you know, they're clearing the path and changing things and going from there. It's just I look at them and I see a lot of emptiness. I see a lot of emptiness in them. I mean, even in prior generations, again, pre internet, pre cell phone, I found
So
kids.
I think what you're seeing, I mean, I'm just taking a look at that now. Is you're seeing, you're tuning into the unconscious ones. And again, it's this whole thing. We've got more people awakening and being awakened than we've ever had alive on the planet ever before.
Without a
We've
doubt.
also, right? And those ones, if you look at those ones, they are shining brightly. They are not vacant and they are not empty.
No,
But
definitely not.
but you've also got the ones who are still unconscious, still asleep, and not embodied. And that's the group that you're tuning into and asking about, I think.
More or less, more or less. It just, I see them and I see the emptiness, you know, I see the emptiness in their eyes and there's, I'm sure they will, for the lack of a better term, awaken at one point in time. I mean, they're going to, uh, everybody
We're all
goes,
on the same journey back to
yeah, it
source
goes to that
energy.
journey.
So
Yeah.
that's the path we're all on together.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
everyone has a different route that they take.
Yeah. I just find the separation greater. The void is getting bigger. I'm not saying the numbers
A bigger
are
void
growing.
has to fill in with more light.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And I think again, it's like a balanced scale, right? Like when you look at the balanced scale, I think if there's more negativity, or more emptiness on this side, or emptiness being a weight, that that the side that's awakened will get greater as well and be deeper, so that the scale balances off. Because we need teachers. We need teachers that are coming forth in the next generations, because they're going to be struggles. They're going to be big struggles, bigger than we've ever seen before.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So before we end up going to our next break, and I don't know if that's fast approaching or not, the other thing I wanted to just remind people of, if you do have a child who you are either struggling to understand, or who you want to find a way of validating their spiritual gifts or teaching them meditation or their spiritual gifts, I do have a book that I wrote a few years ago, and that book is called The Midas Tree. And The Midas Tree is a spiritual novel. And I wrote it for precisely the reason that we're talking about today, that my generation, which I guess is the indigo generation, many of us, we were born these as spirit, and then we went through shutdown because we went through the society, the culture, the education system. And many of us sort of in the middle of our lives went through an awakening process. And we had a lot of clearing to do. We had a lot of baggage that we had to clear from our energy fields in order to reclaim our light and our consciousness and our abilities. And so I wrote The Midas Tree to help, hopefully, a whole generation of children not to have to do that, to stay awake, to be born awake and to stay awake. And so that book is still available. It's available through Amazon, and it's on my website, drlesliephillips.com, and it's also on its own website, themidastree.com, or you can search for it on Amazon. And the reading age is about any kid from sort of 9 all the way up to adults can read that book.
And Dr. Leslie, you know what I think we should do? I think we should give away the first chapter of the book to entice people to read it.
Yeah, we can do that.
Yeah, I think it'd be wonderful if we put the first chapter on,
Yeah,
on the website.
You want to take care of that?
Oh, of course, Dr. Leslie, for you, the world.
Because what I was also going to mention is I have another book coming out in April, but it's available for pre-ordering right now. And that book is more of, it's a non-fiction book, and it's more like an instruction manual to awaken your psychic abilities. And it's more of an adult read. And that book is called Intuition and Chakras. And you can pre-order that right now on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, IndieBound, and Llewellyn, and I think there's another site as well. So that's another great book to help fuel your expansion of your consciousness.
Marvelous, marvelous. That's lovely. And is that more directed, like you said, it's an adult book, but can kids tune into that as well?
I would recommend for kids The Midas Tree. I think there's possibly, but Intuition and Chakras is really densely packed with an enormous amount of spiritual information.
Well, you have to write one for the kids.
And it's the reading age is probably a bit higher than age 12.
You'll have to write one for the kids then.
The Midas Tree.
No, you have to write a chakra and a book for the kids.
Actually, yeah, I do have something in draft form that's a bit like that. It's like a book of parables or fables based on the chakras.
That sounds like fun.
With different animals representing the different chakras.
That's lovely.
So is it time for another break? And shall we have questions after the break?
Yes, it's time for another break. I think we can go. We can do that. That's not a problem.
All
And
right,
we
good.
can
Well,
come back.
listeners, you've been tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie. It's a radio show that broadcasts on 101.7 FM across the Fraser Valley and BC. It's also a podcast on drlesliephillips.com, and we've recently started live streaming on Facebook and on YouTube.
Yay!
We've got to take a break for the radio show, so we will be back after these messages.
Yep. And beep, 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 beep messages. And we're back. And we're back. Hello, folks.
Welcome back, listeners, to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and Corrie, and tonight's edition where we are talking about psychic kids and the evolution of humanity and how different generations appear as the vibration shifts on the planet and as one generation builds a foundation of energy for the next generation to come into.
Yes, that's marvelous. Simply, I love the way it works.
So I believe you've got some questions for me.
Yes, I do have some questions. If there's anybody listening in live streaming, just by all means ask your questions. But we have some questions, and I'll hit the first one. And the first one comes from George. And George says, can the ego have an effect on the ability to learn or enhance these psychic gifts? If it does, I just feel it does based on my observations, but I have no idea that if that is the case. If it does, it suggests that the kids, as they just start their new life cycle, have a smaller ego. And that might help them pick up things much faster. Also, they are better at absorbing new info versus someone who has strong beliefs, personal opinions, and life experience that shape these opinions and views of their own reality, and less flexible intellect. Just open to topic related to kids. If you think you have a comment on this, I'd be open to listen.
Absolutely. And thanks for the question, George. And yes, the answer is yes. The ego can get in the way, or it can hijack things. So either the ego can block your awareness of and access to your psychic abilities, because maybe it's afraid, maybe it's got some programming that psychic abilities are evil, or maybe it's got some programming that it has to please other people and mum and dad want me to do my homework instead. So the ego can interfere and block things. And the other part of your question was, can it enhance things? I would say it can hijack things. So let's say that you have somebody who has a great awareness and is starting to really tune into their higher knowing. Let's say one of these gurus, their ego can hijack their spiritual evolvement. And you see this a lot with all of these gurus that have a following and then lead their following to their demise or something, and who make people worship them, right? So there's lots of examples of the ego hijacking the spiritual path and jumping on the back of somebody's spiritual awareness and psychic abilities. So the ego is something for all of us to be constantly aware of in our spiritual evolution, not to let the ego take over and make us special, or the opposite, and make us unworthy. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? Either you believe you're special because you've had some psychic experiences, or because you haven't, you believe you're unworthy, you're not good enough, and you can't do it. And neither is true. We are all spirit. Psychic abilities are how we communicate as spirit. So the children, yes, they pick up things quicker, but they're also don't have as much baggage. So they're not as closed down in accessing what is their natural birthright, their natural essence. Part of their inner being is their psychic abilities. So I hope that answers your question, George.
Sounds like it may have. I mean, that's what he
It
was
was a
saying.
big, long question, so I might not have grabbed all the pieces of it.
No. Basically, what he was saying, is the with children, the lack of ego, on the with regards to kids, is it more effective in enhancing those abilities and things than all these people with, I guess the term that you use is a very good term, baggage, because people have a lot of baggage. And I mean, you often say, you often talk about kids, who have special friends, invisible friends, or they hear voices and they get trained out of not doing that. Of course, I think a lot of kids, even though we don't remember them, necessarily have those experiences because we are closer. I have another little story to interject here. Um, it was about this little boy. And this is a true story. He got caught uh, under a garage door, an automatic garage door that came down, and he was the lady who was there, the mom that was there, couldn't get the garage door up, and it wasn't one with a photo eye, and he was, if I remember correctly, he was either 2 or 4 years old, one of the two. I can't remember exactly. Anyway, the paramedics came by because he was almost like dead. They thought he was dead, and when the paramedics revived him in the ambulance, mom was in the ambulance with him, he was able to speak. He came back back conscious. He told her about all these places that he had visited while he was asleep. All these buildings and these churches and these beings flying around in churches, and he's describing angels and things like that. And so they just put it to just that he was off in dreamland while he was unconscious. And anyway, afterwards, the mom was talking to somebody, and this fella actually pulled information up. The little boy had described 7 of the major I guess you call them temples or religious sites in the world, to the like very, very in detail, with certain things that he would not have been able to comprehend otherwise. And they figured that he actually visited them while he was on the astral plane in that manner, but very in touch, and he remembered everything that he brought back. It was really interesting.
Actually, and that's another thing that we haven't touched upon, is the other phenomenon that's fairly common is children being aware of past lifetimes.
Ooh, I don't think we've ever spoken about that.
And especially in cultures where reincarnation is embedded in the culture, like in India. So the kids, before they've really settled into the new life, being programmed completely by the new family and everything, will often remember what their name was, where they used to live, who their old family was. And there's been examples of children taking their new parents to visit their old family.
Really?
Yeah, like I remember, I think there's lots of these, but in one in particular, I remember a little boy in India, and he was telling his parents who he was and where he lived, and it was in a different city. And eventually they took him and they met the widow of the old man that the little boy had been.
Cool.
And there were things that he described that there's no way he could have known unless he actually been that.
It's amazing.
Person. So yeah, I mean, and that's another aspect of the conversation, I suppose, is that it's another way in which kids are aware of their multidimensional nature beyond the physical body that they find themselves in.
That's interesting. I don't think you've ever related that story to me. I guess you're keeping secrets. Okay, next question. This is from Michelle. And Michelle says, my daughter claims that she can still see the room with her eyes closed, except for with her eyes closed, she can see spirits that are around in the room. She even tries to prove this to me by walking around unfamiliar places with her eyes closed to prove to me that she can still see. She said sometimes at night when she tries to go to bed, it's hard for her to sleep because when she closes her eyes, instead of darkness, she still sees the room. Today she came home from school and said, Mama, did you know there are 11 spirits here right now and we only know 3 of them? Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, that's amazing, isn't it? And I mean, thank you very much for sharing that information with us. That also reminds me of, and I think, again, this is in India, where there's a teacher that works with children and trains them to do exactly what your daughter is doing, which is to be able to still see everything with their eyes closed. And he has them doing all sorts of tasks with blindfolds on, and they can see. They can see what they're doing with their spiritual vision. So let me just take a quick look at your daughter, see if we can get any useful information for you. Didn't tell us how old she is, but what a real bright,
she did, actually, I think.
bright spark she is. I mean, I'm just seeing you've got like a real, her energy is so bright and so connected. You know, she's so connected. It looks to me like she's just connected with her higher self, with her soul. There's no barrier. She's open. The energy's flowing, and she's a powerhouse. And so I would just validate that she's quite psychically open, and it looks like she's got a lot of information about a lot of this stuff. I'm seeing that she's a little healer as well, actually. Let's see what else we can tell you about her. I mean, there's not much to say apart from wow. She's just like this super bright energy, super open, super connected. And I hope that she manages to retain that. And it sounds like you encourage it, and that's really fantastic. And it looks like she's part of this generation that are really bringing in all of that light and that consciousness onto the earth. And I'm just very thankful for your daughter and other children like her. Thank you so much for sharing that.
So let me ask you a question on her behalf. With her daughter, I don't know, again, I'm not sure how old she is, but she's still going to school, so I presume that she's still young. And if she's still seeing when she's sleeping, when her eyes are closed, what would you recommend for her to be able to relax and I don't want to use the word control, but to be able to relax and sleep and allow those images to just come up when she wants them to come up? Is there anything she can do for that?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I mean, it looks like she's just firing on all cylinders all the time. So there are things that she can do. I'm just trying to think of a simple.
Well, would a grounding meditation help her?
A grounding meditation might help her. Give me a moment to get something useful here. I mean, really what I wanted to say is using her intentions to set the experience of reality that she wants. So if she's going to sleep, she can say that I'm going to have a peaceful sleep. You know, I'm going to, maybe she'll decide what she's going to see. She can project some nice, you know, like the old thing about watching the sheep jump over. I mean, you can decide what images you want to look at. So, I mean, it really is a case of teaching her about her energy, teaching about her, you know, and again, the word control, but how to be in charge of her energy to create different experiences.
Lovely.
So yes, she can learn to be in charge of it so that it doesn't disturb her. I don't know that it's something that I could just say 5 magic words and solve it, but I think the key is just her intentions.
Okay.
If buy the Midas tree, if she's around the age 12 or so, buy the Midas tree. And teach her those techniques in the book.
Yeah. Wonderful. So I have another question, the last question from Val. And Val says, my daughter is 11 and has been talking to spirits and ghosts since she could talk. She just started researching it on her own and believes that she's a psychic medium. I bought her some books for Christmas and I'm thoroughly encouraging it.
That's fantastic.
What advice can you give her?
I'm just going to take a look at your daughter. Well, the guidance I would give is encourage her own unique experience. And one of the things that researching and reading books about it does is it starts to insert some programming from other people and other people's perspectives and other people's opinions and other people's ideas. And there's a lot of information out there about being a psychic medium and what that is and how it works. And a lot of that information that's out there about being a psychic medium and what it is and how it works, in my opinion, is not necessarily correct. And so I think that the more you encourage her to base her to develop her own experience and develop her own understanding based on her own experience, or being discerning about what sources of information that she's learning from, because I think that she can end up going down some side pathways. and so the mistake is often also, and especially when you're a kid, you think, well, adults know more than I do, so if a lady's written a book about it, she must know more than I do. But not necessarily, you know, not necessarily. So I would encourage you to encourage her in her abilities and in her own experience. And whenever she picks up a book or watches someone else's video, to always take away what resonates and feels right for her. That's what I'd say.
Good advice. And never tell her she's seeing things that aren't there. Oh, I think I remember my mom when I was younger. My mom was very actually she was quite psychic to a point, and sometimes I would laugh at her, and then I realized later on in life that she wasn't. It wasn't that funny. That she did have challenges with that because she was more empathic. She could feel her children and her friends what they were going through. It was tough for her. Well, those are great questions, and I hope everybody will get a chance, if they're not online right now, get a chance to read or watch the show, the rerun of this wonderful show. And it's Dr. Leslie. I think it's almost time to go.
Great. Well, thank you, listeners, for tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth. We are a radio show and podcast about metaphysics and spirituality. And every week we talk about a different topic. Tonight's topic has been psychic kids, and join us next week. We're usually going live on Tuesdays from 7 to 8 p.m. Pacific time on 101.7 FM across the Fraser Valley, and also on our YouTube channel and our Awaken Your Psychic Abilities Facebook group.
So that's it for tonight. And this will be posted on our website a week Tuesday. So it's not going to come up exactly right away, but it will show up. So thank you, folks, and we'll see you next week, right, Dr. Leslie?
Yeah, see you then.
Ta-ta for now.
Okay.